Hi, everyone. Welcome to Foresight's Intelligent Corporation Group. I'm really excited today to have Kevin Esvelt here. I know your work has come up plenty of times in our group. Basically, last year and the year before, we really had these sessions on trying to figure out if there are ways in which using new technologies, including cryptography and so forth, we can create a world that still allows technological progress while also having almost an innate or like a very organic way to address many of the risks that technological progress brings along the way. And we've always really struggled with risk from biotechnology and how one may be able to really get a foothold into those. And your work has come up plenty of times in this area. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'll perhaps share a little bit more context during the Q&A, but for now, I just want to make sure that people get to the pleasure of actually watching your presentation as soon as possible. So thanks a lot, Kevin, for joining us. You'll be discussing securing global DNA synthesis and LLMs against hazards too risky for public disclosure. I'll be sharing more info about you and your work here in the chat, and everyone else, assuming that we have quite a bunch of questions at the end piling up. So feel free to already drop yours into the chat during the presentation, or just discuss what's currently going on in the presentation, or raise hand afterwards. Both of them work. All right. Thank you so much, Kevin, for joining. The stage is yours.
All right. Thank you so much for the invitation. So our goal here was to answer a fairly simple question, which is, if we come across hazardous information that could be misused by individual untrustworthy humans to cause catastrophe, how can we intervene to build a system that is trustworthy as a stepping stone towards a world where we rely on trustworthy systems to deal with increasingly powerful technological advances so that we can keep all of the benefits, which we need, while minimizing the risks. So I specialize in catastrophic biothreats and specifically their mitigation. And I'm going to provide a little bit of context on the sort of on the dark side of how our increasing ability to program biology is enabling catastrophic biothreats, and why, if we want to realize the incredible benefits of biotech in all forms, and also with a side of increasing AI, we really need to ensure that we get the good things to happen before the bad things happen. So how can we do that? First, I'm going to point out the obvious, which is that we are demonstrably vulnerable to pandemics, even the natural variety. And I would assert further that we will learn to cause pandemics that are more harmful than anything that is natural. And we can be fairly confident that this is true just by invoking Feynman, who of course said, "What I cannot create, I do not understand." We aim to understand and learn to program biology to accomplish all manner of amazing things. But it would be extremely strange if we did not learn how to create pandemics. And of course, natural pandemic viruses are not optimized to cause harm. They're optimized to replicate. And any system that is unoptimized for a given purpose can typically be improved fairly readily through deliberate optimization. So we should assume that engineered viruses will be able to cause considerably greater harm than the natural pandemics to which we are already vulnerable. What's the current state of affairs? Probably 30,000 people can make 1918 influenza virus, which is fairly unlikely to cause a pandemic today. If we're concerned about coronaviruses or things of similar size, probably in the low thousands of individuals. And thankfully, given that variola major is far and away the most likely and credible pandemic threat that we face when it comes to deliberate threats, smallpox, probably only a couple hundred individuals can plausibly perform reverse genetics to rescue variola major and obtain the relevant DNA, if even that many. And that's just because the genome is so large and you need another live pox virus to boot it up. Even so, that's an awful lot of people who can perform reverse genetics and gain access to infectious samples. And of course, now we have AI systems that are really quite useful as sounding boards in the laboratory and making plans more generally. But it's true that if you cannot perform reverse genetics, say you don't know how to culture mammalian cells in the lab, LLMs will suggest people who can perform that protocol for you. So they specifically will point out that you can hire a CRO to perform reverse genetics and give you infectious samples of influenza virus. There are also university core facilities that will do this for you. And many of them don't actually sequence the DNA that you give them in advance. Certainly not if you provide them with a sequencing file. So one could readily use these services to obtain a pandemic agent, even if you don't have the skills personally. So the number who could access these kinds of viruses is even higher. That suggests that once we identify viruses highly likely to cause pandemics, or worse, they will pretty much immediately become widely accessible. And the reason is that all of the relevant steps for obtaining them are pretty unrestricted. Our society has not done a very good job of this. So if we want to solve this, we need to address two main challenges. Number one, we need to screen all custom DNA synthesis globally, because far and away the easiest way to get access to any kind of pandemic hazard is to order synthetic DNA corresponding to its genome sequence, and then to perform reverse genetics using the protocols. But if you don't know how to perform reverse genetics, then you can send it to one of these CROs or eventually cloud labs. So we need to ensure that those orgs will also screen all the DNA that they're sent. So how can we think about this? I'm a very visual thinker. So I like to think of the value of hazards being the set of all sequences that we believe could cause catastrophic harm in biology. Now, sequence space is hyper-astronomically vast. We can't think in that many dimensions, but it's still useful to think spatially about this. So if we imagine all of the hazards being clustered in various places across this valley, we need to somehow restrict access to unauthorized users while still allowing legitimate researchers who are trying to develop therapeutics and cures and vaccines for a lot of the viruses that are already afflicting us. We still need to allow them access. How can we do this? We need some way of determining who is legitimate, and we'll return to that at the very, very end, and which sequences are and are not hazardous. Because 99.999% of biological research does not involve anything that would pose anything remotely like a pandemic class threat. What we do now is we encourage, but do not require DNA synthesis firms to screen their orders, which they do essentially on their own terms using their own systems. So the International Gene Synthesis Consortium is a group of firms that are heroic in the sense that they actually sacrifice their bottom line to screen orders and do the right thing. And it's costly to them because the algorithms that they use require a human in the loop. The problem is that because it's costly, only 9 out of the 26 gene synthesis firms in the United States are members of the IGSC. And the others presumably don't screen at all, which means that we have a bunch of disconnected segments of fence blocking off this valley of hazards. And what's more, if you ask an LLM chatbot to explain whether companies cooperate to check orders and customer permissions for DNA synthesis, then they'll tell you all about the IGSC, but they'll note that not all companies are members. And you can say, oh, is there a list of members? And they'll say, yeah, check their website. So it's very trivial just to walk around all of our current defenses. There's just no point immediately in improving those defenses until we can somehow make screening universal. So if an adversary today, then, to rephrase this, is interested in obtaining hazardous DNA for next-generation influenza or whatever else, they're just going to order it from one of the non-IGSC members, and they will obtain it no problem. So if we want to change this, we need to encourage these companies to actually screen, whether by forcing them through government mandates, which is difficult to achieve, but we're working on. But ideally, we want to make screening free. And if it's going to be free, then we can't require expensive humans with PhDs in the loop. So we need it to be fully automated, and it needs to be highly specific, because you can't require a human in the loop to check any false alarms. The next problem is that if we return to our valley, we've been trying to fence off the entrance to this, but that assumes that there are companies to which you submit an order and they send you DNA in the mail. Of course, there are also devices that synthesize DNA. And increasingly, as we get better and better at making DNA with biology rather than chemistry, switching over to enzymatic synthesis, there are more and more companies that are working on, and in one case have actually deployed, enzymatic synthesizers that are benchtop models, which join the chemical synthesizers that are benchtop models. Vast majority of people still get their DNA from the big centralized providers walking through the mouth of the valley. But these benchtop synthesizers basically amount to a stairwell over the nearest mountain into the valley. So if we hope to actually screen all DNA synthesis, we need some way to address these benchtop machines. Otherwise, the adversary is just going to buy one and make whatever DNA they want. That means we need to integrate screening into all of the benchtops, which again requires it to be fully automated. Then we face this problem. Suppose we manage to fence off both of these avenues. There's all kinds of ways that you can break through fences. And in this case, an adversary could do any number of things. I'm just going to highlight a couple of them. First, they could order short oligonucleotides, short pieces of DNA that can be assembled into something larger that is hazardous, like a viral genome, but are too short to screen using current algorithmic approaches. So in order to address this, we need to use up screening algorithms that are applicable to very short oligos, which again increases our demand for highly specific screening, somehow distinguishing between things that we believe are hazardous and all of the very similar biological sequences that are harmless, which need to be accessible to the entire scientific community. Another thing that they could do is they could ensure that they wait until we identify a new pandemic class threat and then immediately place an order before we've updated our definitions of what is hazardous. That is, we have to move the fence according to where in the valley the hazards are to ensure that we're fencing in all the hazards. And we're continually going to discover new patches of hazards and need to adjust our fence to include them. This process needs to be quicker. Adversary will take advantage of it. And that means that we really can't afford to let everyone have their own database and update it on their own sweet time. We need some kind of ideally centralized system that can ensure that the database is up to date. But that means that if you're, say, Pfizer, you need to send your orders to some third party that is checking them for hazards. But if you give me the DNA synthesis and gene synthesis order request list for any given biotech or pharma, I can give you a pretty good idea of what it is that they're currently researching. That is, these are trade secrets. So whatever system we use needs to be privacy preserving. And in order to be privacy preserving, it needs to be efficient, because too much complex computation is even more computation when you have to apply cryptography. So I would submit that this problem is just flat out insoluble with current screening methods. And that's because we screen based on the same way that we determine whether biological species are related. We use similarity search algorithms that if you find an initial sequence, it will tell you all of the things that are similar to that sequence that are natural and biological. That is, it will grab everything that is similar, even if it's from something that is not obviously not hazardous, that uses part of the same sequence. And these are all false alarms. But it just is not designed to avoid deliberate evasion attempts. So it's very easy to bypass this. And BLAST is also quite slow and inefficient, so you really can't apply cryptography, barring new advances in homomorphic encryption. So this is the main problem. We just cannot rely on this. So our proposed solution is to say, all right, instead of just screening for everything that is similar, we need to specifically screen for things that are functional equivalents of the hazard itself. And in order to do that, we need to specify them in advance, and we need to screen for, again, short oligonucleotides, short subsequences. So what we do is we break out the entire hazard into short subsequences. And then for each of those, we pick some of them at random. And then we compute millions of predicted functional variants. That is, alternative sequences that could be substituted for the original that we expect would still keep the function of the relevant hazard. And once we have this list of sequences that is well-defined, we can then compare it to all known harmless sequences and throw out anything that also matches something that's harmless. So what's left is effectively a set of signatures of matching this particular hazard and plausible ways of changing its sequence that still retain that hazardous function. The nice thing about this is the exact match. So it's extremely efficient, and you can apply cryptographic methods to preserve privacy. And it's very sensitive because we're including functional variants. So how would this work in terms of generating the screening database? Just another depiction. Select the pathogens you want to screen against, split them into short fragments, generate functional variants, then compare this to a list of confirmed non-hazardous sequences and remove them. So if on the left you have all sequences, split all those into subsequence fragments. In our particular version right now, we screened for 30 base pair fragments, 42 base pair fragments, with somewhat different definitions of how many mutations we screen for in terms of the functional variants, but also 20 amino acid windows where we screen for functional peptide variants. So we have all subsequence windows of all sequences on the left, and then we have the known hazards and their subsequences on the right. Then we predict functional variants of the known hazards. Then we compare them, and we check for every one of those windows, for all of the matches, was the match from something that is also from a hazard or something so closely related to the hazard that it's the same thing. And if it's not, if it's a match to a harmless, then you throw it out. If it is, then you keep it. And that set of subsequences is our curated hazards database. So that's how we build the database. The next question is it good enough? Because there's all kinds of programs and tacit knowledge that allows you to tinker with a biological sequence to change it in ways that likely preserve its function. So we wanted to know, can you bypass the system by deliberately including functional variants? So we wanted to test this against a virus in particular, but not a harmful virus. So we took a bacteriophage M13 and we split into two groups. We had the blue team set up a defense system that screens based on these predicted functional variants. And then the red team predicted their own functional variants for each of these 9 windows. They were given the rest of the viral genome. So that stays constant. That's a freebie for them. And they had up to 21,000 attacks at each window. So we actually made 21,000 predicted functional variants by the red team for each of these 9 windows. And then we measured the ability of these mutated viruses that resulted to infect. So this gave us a measurement of the comparative fitness of each of these predicted functional variants that were all attacked by the red team. And then we could compare and see how many of those attacks were intercepted by the defensive system, or rather, how many of them were not intercepted, how many of them got through screening and were also functional. Then we have this question, okay, what is functional? Where do you draw the line for viral fitness? And here's where our recent education in epidemiology comes in. A virus will cause a pandemic if it has an effective R value above 1. Different viruses have different R0 values. Original ancestral SARS-2 was around 2.5, we think. But measles has been estimated to be as high as 18. So if you want to knock measles down below the level where it can cause a pandemic in an unprotected human population, you need to reduce its fitness 20-fold. So 0.05 or lower. So if we set that as the threshold, these are on the x-axis, this is predicted fitness, and the y-axis is the experimentally determined fitness for one of these windows. So everything above the measles line, we count as functional. And the blue ones were the ones intercepted by the defensive system, and the yellow ones were the ones that got through. So this window blocked about 90% of attacks. You can see it was better at detecting the smaller dots, which had fewer mutations, than it was the larger yellow dots that had more mutations. But if you combine all 9 windows, even though this was actually the best at 90%, all 9 windows together blocked 99.996% of attacks. And the actual system that we've built defends each hazardous sequence at 170 such windows for peptides, plus the 30 base pair and 42 base pair windows. Long story short, I don't think I can engineer anything to get through this system. At least not anything that is 30 base pairs and over. So the next challenge is preserving privacy. How do you run an exact match comparison without disclosing what the actual sequences are? The answer is you do a 1-to-1 cryptographic matching, cryptographic hash step. So this is a 1-to-1 mapping that transforms a particular information string into another seemingly gibberish string. But because it's 1-to-1, any given information string will be transformed into a specific string of gibberish. If you run this process using what's called a distributed oblivious pseudorandom function, then none of the information escapes the original machine. And the overall process of hashing is actually multi-step. There's an initial step that occurs on the original machine. And then that hashed value gets sent to a number of key servers, which then perform additional hashing steps collectively without ever gaining access to the original value. That's why it's oblivious, and it's distributed because you need a certain majority of key servers to perform it. And then they send back the value to the source of the order, which then applies another computation that using a key that only they know to generate the final value. So that's the hashed subsequences of all the orders. What do you compare them to? You compare them to all of the subsequences in the hazards database that have been subjected to the ideal process, to the same process rather. So specifically, cryptographically, this is very straightforward, and we wanted this to not use any novel cryptography because we want this to be an internationally accepted system. And governments get touchy about novel cryptography and specifically sharing novel cryptography with other governments perceived as rivals. So this is all fairly standard. The synthesizer takes its orders, breaks them up into subsequences, and applies a standard SHA hash, then raises the results to a exponent R to blind it, then sends these blinded values over to this network of key servers, which are going to calculate the final hash value. The key servers then each provide one piece of an additional hashing step, and they send the result back. The synthesizer then raises this value to R to the -1 to restore the final hashed value, which is a simple SHA hash and then plus the key server hash. So this ensures that no information leaks from the original synthesizer. And in order to determine what the actual order was, you would need to build a rainbow table of all possible sequences hashed in this way, which would require you to subvert sufficient key servers and to do so before they rotate the keys, which they do periodically. So this final value, then the synthesizer just needs to send it to the screening database, which has already gone through this process with the key servers for all of its internal data. So then it just needs to say, okay, is this hash value I just received present anywhere in my database? And if so, then I can return the results. If the hazard is publicly known, I can say, yes, in fact, it was this particular sequence out of the hazard. But I also don't have to tell. I can just say yes or no, and we'll get to that later. Or rather, when I say later, actually sooner. So we don't always want to disclose what it is that we think is hazardous necessarily. This is a future capability, I emphasize, that we think is going to be important for the future, but people tend to get tripped up around it. So I just want to point out that we expect to identify new pandemic class agents in the future. We expect to identify new ways of engineering biology to cause harm worse than standard pandemics. We could add these to the database openly. And right now, norms in biology encourage open identification of new pandemic agents. You literally get a new Science Nature or Cell paper if you can accumulate sufficient laboratory evidence that strongly suggests that a newly discovered and characterized virus is likely to cause a pandemic. This is true even though that knowledge typically allows all of these people I outlined earlier to single-handedly gain access to infectious samples and deliberately infect people with it, possibly causing a pandemic. Ideally, we wouldn't want to make these things public. So the nice thing about the system is that it is symmetric. That is, it protects the privacy of the orders, but it also protects the privacy of the database contents. And that's equally efficient. So we can actually crowdsource threat identification. That is, if anyone in the world spots a new catastrophic hazard in biology, ideally, we want to persuade them to not tell the entire world what it is and why they think it would kill a lot of people. Instead, we would want them to get in touch with a curator who works with a screening system and explain the hazard to one other person. Because again, we assume humans are fallible. And if you distribute big red buttons that could kill a lot of people around enough, sooner or later, someone will push one. So we want to minimize the number of people who need to be involved. If they contact one curator and the curator agrees with their assessment that the sequence is hazardous, then the curator can add it to the database, along with a suitable number of decoys. And this would prevent people who don't have explicit access to that, authorized access to that class of sequences from obtaining it. And the goal here is to not make it impossible for researchers to obtain such things, but to force them to get permission from their biosafety committee before they actually run a proof of principle concept in which they do something clever involving that sequence. We want to make it bureaucratically annoying to run clever new experiments involving sequences that somebody else thinks could be catastrophically hazardous. But we don't want to forbid it, because if it's forbidden, people get very interested. And that's why the decoys need to be in there. There's a 90 to 95% chance that your clever idea, which just got rejected by the system without telling you why, or exactly what the problem is, was in fact just a decoy. You're going to be a lot less curious about exploring why it is that that sequence may or may not be hazardous. So all of these are capabilities that we want in a system. And we have now built a software package that accomplishes all of these things. So we call it Secure DNA, and it's run within a Swiss foundation called the Secure DNA Foundation. And that foundation is independent from all government influence. We keep relevant governments abreast of what we're doing, but we don't actually let them become directly involved in the operation of the system or its direct development, because due to rival competitions, if you have one government be involved, then their rivals are going to be much less likely to trust the system. So this was an international science diplomacy effort of academics and industry folks attempting to solve a problem without the direct involvement of governments. So our team includes biotechnologists like myself, a lot of cryptographers and information security specialists who ensure that we import all the best practices from cybersecurity. I can tell you that just from associating with them, my own security mindset, that is the way that I learned to think about hazards and how we can deal with them, has improved tremendously, but I'm still the equivalent of a 3-year-old toddler. The problem is that the norms and practices of cybersecurity and security mindset are almost entirely absent, not just from the life sciences, which again thinks that we should actively disclose viruses that we think could kill millions of people, or worse, even though we know we don't have defenses adequate to prevent them from being used to kill millions of people. But also, even in the biosecurity community, we really are struggling to deal with these norms and practices. So secure DNA is a way of bridging these two fields in hopes of importing some of the norms of ways of thinking about vulnerability and potential for misuse and bringing that into the life sciences. Now, there is one thing that we haven't implemented yet, and that is that problem I alluded to at the beginning. You need to ensure that the authorized folks can enter the valley and obtain DNA sequences corresponding to hazards that they have permission for. But how do we determine who gets permission? We already have a system in place that does this for almost all the relevant actors. And that's because the US and most other countries have some form of institutional biosafety committee or biosafety authority that evaluates proposed recombinant DNA experiments, ostensibly before they're performed, to ensure that they're not going to be unsafe. So my laboratory has to submit what are plans for experiments to MIT's Institutional Biosafety Committee, which then approves them before we perform the experiments. Now, you can imagine how many labs actually do this the way they're supposed to. There's nothing forcing you to actually inform the committee before you perform the quick proof of principle. And it's a bunch of paperwork to explain your project and what you want to do and the safety precautions you're going to take. So the normal practice in most labs is to perform a quick proof of principle to see whether the idea is promising, and only then tell the biosafety committee. With universal DNA synthesis screening, you would not be able to perform the proof of principle experiment if it involves something that was hazardous without permission, because you would only be able to get the DNA if the biosafety committee authorizes the experiment. How can we make this work? The biosafety committee already grants each individual laboratory permission to work with a particular set of hazards or innocuous sequences. That exemption list can be converted into a certificate chain, whereby the biosafety committee or biosafety officer or authority can grant a certificate to the laboratory with the exemption list, pointing to an exemption list that could be anonymized. And then anyone associated with the laboratory who can verify their identity through a two-factor hardware authentication could then order any DNA corresponding to the exemption list. So the idea is that the biosafety committees can use secure DNA to ease the evaluation process by helping them determine what is and is not considered hazardous or possibly prone to misuse. And we can leverage that existing permission structure to determine who and who should not have access to potentially hazardous sequences. So the IBCs are effectively our gatekeepers. So we're working on this and we anticipate finishing this aspect by the end of the year. Finally, this brings us to the last point, which is how do we deal with all these contract research orgs and increasingly cloud laboratories that can perform biological experiments on customer-provided nucleic acid sequences? If you really grill an LLM on it, it will not only tell you that you can contract with one of these firms or remote labs to perform experiments that you want, it will suggest ways that you can trick them into performing reverse genetics on a different virus than they think. And of course, the LLMs are also very good at phishing attacks. And unfortunately, most folk in the life sciences space are not very, shall we say, up to date on cybersecurity best practices. So you should assume that all of these firms have very insecure networks that, especially with AI assistants, could be penetrated. And if you, again, think about it, you're going to realize that you can provide them with a sequencing file that allegedly corresponds to the DNA that you send them. And even if they check it and sequence it on their own, you could substitute another sequencing file from the alleged thing for the one that actually turns up. So we need to ensure that they all not only sequence all customer provided DNA, but ideally do it using a secure DNA equipped sequencing machine that will only talk to the secure DNA key servers and database and will not talk to any other source of information. There's ways of even ensuring that the sequencer itself remains air-gapped and there's only a one-way flow of information outward. So if we do this, then we can close that loophole whereby people who can somehow access the DNA for something that's hazardous, say from an existing laboratory that has already ordered it, or from any of the potential ways through our screening systems, will not at least be able to perform that last reverse genetic step unless they do it on their own. So I'm going to stop here and not talk too much about LLMs themselves and protein design models and how we need to regulate the AI systems to ensure that they don't grant widespread access to increasing catastrophic biorisk or put together the key concepts, A plus B plus C, that require some amount of domain expertise and creativity that would potentially push the envelope of how hazardous things are. I'm happy to discuss that in the following discussion. But first, I just wanted to highlight the amazing team that put all of this together. In particular, thanks go to Dana Gretton, who's now a PhD student in my lab. But when he was an undergrad at MIT, he was very interested in this general problem, and we got to talking about it. And he had enough of a background in computer science and cryptography, and also in hardware engineering, that he could effectively translate the biological concerns into those languages. And then we contacted the crypto group at MIT. They introduced us to a number of colleagues in China who provided some key advice. And then later on, some folks in Europe. So now we have this broad international team of academics and a team of very talented software developers working in Rust who have been actually building the system. And we have several synthesis providers and device manufacturer partners in the US, EU, and China that are testing different aspects of the system and helping us optimize them. So None of this could have happened without all of them. So tremendous thanks. And also to my laboratory. I actually run a biotech lab on the side that does not do anything necessarily related to biodefense for many of the projects. And they put up with me devoting so much of my time to this additional issue because they understand that it's important. And with that, I'm going to leave it on this slide, and I'd be happy to take questions and hear what all of you think. Thanks so much.
Wow, this was amazing. Thank you so much. I think I only had a very, very, very shallow understanding of this before now. And I know that there's a lot of things that you didn't double click on yet, but I hope we get to that in the questions. This was really great. Thank you so much for joining. We have a long list of questions already. Do you feel up for taking them?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, good. Then we're starting.
In the chat, she said we were starting with me. So I'm going to assume she said that, even though she muted before she said that. Hey, Kevin. So I have seen a bunch of this before, but I was wondering, when the way you describe the system, when something's rejected by the screening, it seems like all they get back is a no, and there's no flag to anyone saying that, hey, somebody just asked to do something dangerous. You said that you don't think you could design something that would get past the screening, but if there's nothing preventing lots and lots of attempts, is there a concern that a bad actor just keeps trying until they get something through?
Yes. So great question. Yes. This is why we actually throttle the number of requests based on the certificate source. So the total amount of DNA synthesis per year is a tiny, 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 tiny fraction of the number of possible subsequences of all sizes. So we just need to throttle the amount of screening that anyone can perform based on the amount of DNA that they can plausibly synthesize. And then that prevents people from taking too many shots on goal. I noticed you had another question in chat on my assertion that could we plausibly become better at fighting pandemics than we can improve our ability to engineer new ones? And my long story short assertion is this is where security mindset comes in. I think we can become immune to pandemics. I'm optimistic. I think that we cannot do so using biology. That is, biology creates the problem, and biology cannot solve the problem because biology is logistically constrained. That is, you need to come up with the cure or the vaccine in advance. But I would also not rely on vaccines. And so first of all, the baseline security mindset says, look, the adversary is smarter than you. The adversary is better resourced than you. The adversary knows something about your defensive systems because they're operating from the future and have had a chance to learn about it and probe it. And the adversary is operating with the benefit of future technologies that you don't even know exist at the time. So build your defenses accordingly. That's a high bar. You can't always meet it, but it's good to assume that the adversary will always be able to come up with sequences that can cause catastrophic harm. We might be able to mitigate that harm, but nevertheless. So we should not assume that we will always be able to come up with a counter to any given threat. More realistically, I would just submit that from the cyber perspective, if you have a system that is hardware insecure, that is just vulnerable on a hardware level, we tend to assume that you cannot inject software-based information packets into that system and install an antiviral detection system under that hardware insecure machine. That does not make it secure. It's still going to be vulnerable. And of course, if a machine like that has already been compromised, we definitely don't assume that injecting information packets in after the fact is going to fix it. That is, a competent adversary can have broken it irreparably or compromised it to cause additional harm and so forth. We can probably break it again so it can't be used to cause harm, but we can't restore it to its original function. And because evolution built all of our bodies, and evolution does not defend against combinatorial attacks, because evolution doesn't devise combinatorial attacks either, then I would submit that all of our biological hardware, all of our bodies are fundamentally hardware insecure. And you should just never assume that any amount of biological tweaking, injecting information packets, will render them robust to an adversary who can inject information packets. Even if those information packets infect only a few of our cells, you should assume the whole system is compromised because the whole system is hardware insecure. So I could be wrong. We could come up with something unexpected, but on baseline, this is why I would just assume the solution to biorisk is do not let the adversary inject information packets into your body. And I think we can do that. It's just that the solutions do not involve biotechnology. They involve things like 222 nanometer lights and ensuring that we have awesome pandemic-proof PPE and ways of detecting things early so that we can stay away from each other if necessary, and those kinds of technologies. None of which is the focus of this particular talk, but all of which I am quite optimistic about. Everything I've described is to buy us time to ensure that as we learn about ways of programming biology to cause catastrophic harm, we want to reduce the probability of misuse so that until we can effectively defend ourselves from all pandemics. I didn't really get to your question, David.
I think that we can let other people. I could bug you with questions for hours.
Yeah, you totally could. But you said something really important, which is, and it's a common misconception. That is, this talk, the interesting part I think that many people are interested in is guarding against things that we can't tell everyone about. That's inherently interesting, dealing with those information hazards. But we do tell everyone exactly what it is that they hit for the public hazards. So a scientist can, if they accidentally order something that matches a public hazard, they can re-engineer their sequence to remove the match and still accomplish what they wanted to. Probably can't get access to the hazard itself, but if it was on accident, then they can respond and deal with it. All right.
I think I'm next.
Wonderful. Next on our way out.
Yeah. I just had two comments. I've just found that fully homomorphic encryption is being used in production to do set inclusion, which I believe is what you're doing, and might be simpler than your hash-based scheme. And the second point is the W3C has a standards effort on verifiable credentials that might be appropriate for the lab approval part of your work. And I just wondered if you were aware of those two things.
So I was not aware. I was aware of the first one. We have Vinod Vaikuntanathan, who does a lot of the homomorphic advances, is one of our cryptographers on our team. So he is still of the opinion that the DOPRF system is superior to current homomorphic. He's optimistic that eventually we might even be able to use BLAST with homomorphic. It would cost a lot more. The whole secure DNA system can screen global DNA synthesis now for a machine using machines that cost baseline $5,000 for the database server and then an AWS bill of $5,000 a month. And we have enough capacity to screen global DNA synthesis, which is pretty incredible. It costs almost nothing. But if you're willing to burn more money, you could definitely use alternative methods of detection. The W3C I was not aware of. That's one where our folks working on it are maybe aware of it, but I'll definitely bring it to their attention because I definitely didn't know that. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Do you mean Jason?
Sorry, Kevin.
Yeah, okay, sorry. Folks are cutting in and out. But hi, Kevin, really great work and great talk. I write a lot about progress and safety, and you are somebody I point to often as an example of a researcher who both takes risks seriously, but also really looking for solutions. That's a rare combination. Most people are either kind of complacent about risks or fairly defeatist about ever finding solutions. Thank you for that, providing that great example. This is really interesting stuff. I'm just curious, what are the remaining steps like from here until this system is actually protecting the world? It feels to me like probably some governments need to take some action, but just like in general, what's from here to fully implementing this?
Thank you for writing about progress studies and taking seriously the fact that we need to address risks in order to prevent popular backlash. A lot of my work on Gene Drive was similarly geared towards, hey, maybe we need to ensure the initial introduction was viewed as positively so that we can roll out more beneficial applications without that risk of backlash, which I think is. And again, I'm
preventing backlash. Preventing backlash is important. Preventing people dying is also pretty important. So let's do both.
And the two tend to go together. So seems important. Yeah, government action is eventually going to be necessary. It's not clear that we need most governments to do it, but we need probably 2 out of the 3 large blocks. Well, actually, China is a must. And then you probably need either the US or Europe to actually mandate screening eventually. So we are actively engaged in policy discussions on all of these fronts. China is always hard to read, but of course, as soon as they decide to do it, that is it. Top down, everyone there will have to do it. And our Chinese colleagues on Secure DNA are in active discussions with folks there, not just in Chinese industry, but with relevant agencies there. So I'm reasonably optimistic. And then in the US, there are efforts at both the executive branch level, because you really just need a national security directive to require screening through the federal select agent program. And then there's also efforts on the Hill and draft legislative language for the Pandemic All Hazards Preparedness Act, which I know David has been involved in as well. And failing that, the NDAA come November is a backup plan for getting some requirement for screening. And one barrier to that consistently has been that no country has wanted to require its own industries, its own firms to do screening because it's costly, and then they'd be putting them at a competitive disadvantage relative to all the countries that don't screen. So having a freely available system that anyone can use is really important for that. The hard part is going to be getting all of the benchtops to require a phone home connection, which I think was another question in the chat. But that said, the leading enzymatic synthesis benchtop manufacturer is, we've asked DNA Script for clarity on their customer base. They say that 80% of their current customers want machines that are not connected to the internet. And this is for two groups. One of them is militaries. And we just assume that militaries can make whatever the heck they want. Like, sure, it'd be great if they screened, but we can't really stop them from getting synthesizers that don't screen, and they can make whatever they want. That's just not the point of secure DNA. So it's okay if we miss those. But the second group is our InfoSec folks have determined their threat model is that they might have to talk to the IT department. That is, these are a bunch of biologists at pharma who, if they order a machine that has to connect to some external server, they need to talk to IT about getting a hole in the corporate firewall. And they do not want to have to talk to IT under any circumstances whatsoever, no matter what. So they want a machine that does not require any internet connection for that reason alone. But our workaround for that is that since pharma is not draconian about InfoSec and actually allows their employees personal cell phones, Secure DNA works on a browser app for any browser. And so we can build it into the synthesizers such that employees can whip out their phone, and then the synthesizer will perform the initial subsequence analysis, display it as a series of QR codes that they can pick up on their phone. The phone then sends it to the key servers, takes the answer back, displays QR codes they can show to the synthesizer, which then does the de-exponentiation, shows another QR code that the phone picks up, sends it to the database, retrieves the example, standard public-private key encryption, can then give the synthesizer the, yes, this sequence was actually screened, here is the result. If it's clear, go ahead. And we think we can get it down to sub 30 seconds for that, which obviously makes a mockery of information security within pharma because we just bypass their firewall while leaving an air gap. But they're the ones who are letting their employees do this. And if they can't convince their employees to talk to the IT department, yeah, they could just talk to IT and do the right thing. But if they really don't want to, we can get around it in this way. So I'm reasonably optimistic there. But at the end of the day, government mandates are going to be needed to close the last few gaps in that fence. What I'm most concerned about is that folks, and then we're going to need trading programs, right? Because all the current synthesizers, including the ones that use phosphoramidite chemistry, are still out there. And you can still buy them on eBay. So we're going to, once we get it integrated hardware level into next gen synthesizers, we just need subsidized trade-in programs, get as many people as possible to trade in their old machine for a new one. And then if we can get it get all the enzymatic synthesis machines, then we can control access to the baseline phosphoramidite reagents that are required for the old machines, because phosphoramidites are not very stable. So when you start regulating phosphoramidites, because they're not really useful for other stuff, and then all of the older machines are so much useless junk. So that's our plan to hopefully accelerate the process of getting screening into all current synthesizers. And yeah, and then go ahead.
I was just going to say, I was going to move on to the next question, unless you still want to fill anything in here. Okay, wonderful. We have so many more questions. I doubt that we'll get to them all, but maybe we can try at least one more, which is from Michael.
So my original comment was just that I think that you can do your set inclusion with a ZK proof by just having the person who has the thing they want to prove is not in a set, you give them just its list of hashes, and then they give you a ZK proof that proves that their item is not in that. But you said something that I'm more curious in, so I'm going to change my question. If we can't stop governments from doing this, I believe throughout all of history, every single bioweapon ever has been built by governments, not by civilians. And so it feels like stopping all the civilians from building bioweapons isn't going to help us at all, when that is not the set of people who have, historically at least, built bioweapons. Now, this could change if building a bioweapon becomes so trivial that any Joe can do it, but it just feels like we're targeting the wrong demographic here.
So I am actually much more worried. So I'm worried about two things. I'm worried about the leak of extremely sophisticated nasties from government biological weapons labs, which is why enforcing the norms of the BWC is important. But I think an increasing amount of risk, it does come from private actors, just because if you look at historically, baseline rate for expected release by an individual terrorist with access to pandemic capabilities is 2%. Just based on one, that is, we know one historical mass murderer who we know definitely wanted to kill as many people as possible using biology. And that was Seiichi Endo of the Aum Shinrikyo terrorist group, who was pretty miserable at making anthrax because he was a virologist, not a bacteriologist, although his scheme for doing so was reasonably sophisticated. But he was a graduate of Kyoto University in virology, the specialty in what passed for genetic engineering in 1990. So anyone with that background today can get their hands on any influenza virus, paramyxovirus, coronavirus, adenovirus, anything under 40 kb that they want. No problem. They can get all the protocols working and single-handedly release combinatorial pandemics, assuming they know what a pandemic class agent is. So I am much more concerned about deliberate pandemics from potential genocidal or even omnicidal non-state actors than I am from deliberate use by most nation states, just because slow spread and difficulty of targeting, especially in a stable manner, just make transmissible biological weapons profoundly unattractive to state level actors who have a pretty strong incentive to keep non-state actors from getting their hands on it, because biological weapons are asymmetric, are the ideal for asymmetric. It really is accessible to one individual. And I've asked some of my grad students to see if they can follow reverse genetics protocols with no prior experience in virology, and they can. And yeah, MIT students are great, but there's a lot of people on that level. So I'm more worried about non-state actors for what it's worth. But that's partly because my model has that as soon as someone articulates the concept for a very sophisticated biological weapon in public, scientists will immediately have an argument over whether or not it will work. And then we'll start running laboratory experiments to determine whether each piece of it would actually work. And Grammar Mag journals will publish those because there will be controversy, and they publish controversy. And the norm is that we need to know what the threats are in order to defend, even though logistical constraints means even if we had all of our anti-SARS-CoV-2 measures at the beginning of the pandemic, we still couldn't have stopped it from killing millions of people. So people just aren't thinking about this clearly.
We have one final question. Mark, can you unmute? I think you're unmuted,
Yes.
but I don't hear you.
Yeah. So besides militaries versus private, there's a third category that is already an example of an actual anthrax attack, the anthrax attacks after 9/11, which was by a researcher in a authorized government lab, but the researcher was a rogue researcher. So there's the threat of authorizing, the threat of militaries being able to do whatever they want anyway, and the threat of researchers in authorized labs, researchers who've been officially authorized but go rogue, is a distinct category than just militaries versus private.
Yeah, that's right. Inside threat from authorized labs is always going to be there. The goal of this can at least mitigate that, because the odds of someone already working in a lab where they have access to a particular threat is certainly less likely than just anyone who has the skills to pull it off. So they would need to still get permission for their current lab to have the relevant thing, which at least has a chance of being detected. But I freely admit this does not ultimately solve the problem. That is, I could persuade my IBC to get most things through. Yeah. So no, it's not an ideal system,
we
but
are.
we also don't want to delay legitimate research. And we also don't want the system to be able to be used to interfere with legitimate business purposes, for, as Bingo brought up in the chat.
Yeah, which was another question. I know we're 1 minute already over time. I would hate to let you go without asking the standard question, which is, if people are really excited about your work, what can they do to support you, your lab, your individual efforts on this front? How can they learn more? What's the bottleneck?
Yeah, definitely reach out. We can certainly use support. The challenge I always face is I spend most of my time thinking about how to balance these things, and which is not exactly what the traditional funding structures support. So I'm really grateful for the non-traditional philanthropic funders who support this kind of work, and we are wholly dependent on them, and additional financial support is welcome, but really just folks with diverse expertise. Like, this project crosses so many disciplines. And I think there's tremendous benefits to folks just reaching out about something that we may not have thought of, because it stretches across so many different areas that I think it's almost certain that we're missing things, and probably potentially profoundly. And I'm certainly there's better ways of doing this, and we're ignorant of current technologies advancing in other areas. So I would love to hear folks' thoughts. And I love to discuss the theoretical side. This is an example of a system that is trustworthy because it's just a bunch of cryptographic algorithms and hash table lookup. But eventually we want systems that are more trustworthy than humans, that can take more complex actions to mitigate risks. So is there a way to build the bridge towards those kinds of systems, eventually towards benevolent ASI in the long run? I think that's the hope. And I personally think that that's the way to go. And I'm optimistic. So I'd love to hear people's thoughts and pushback.
Thank you so much for joining. Thanks everyone for your great questions. I'm so sorry we didn't get to do all of them, but I hope it wasn't the last time that we hear from you. And thanks for your fantastic work. And yeah, if anyone's interested in reaching out with specific bits and pieces and how they can support, that would certainly be welcome. Thank you, Kevin. Thanks everyone. And I hope to see you for the next one very soon.